It was an ordinary morning in the coffee shop, or so it seemed. The sun was shining, and the usual crowd of people sat quietly, sipping their drinks, typing on laptops, or having casual conversations. But today, something was about to happen that would change everything. A black woman in her early 30s sat by the window, enjoying her hot coffee. She was dressed in a smart, casual outfit, a stylish jacket, simple blouse, and jeans, looking calm and relaxed. She was a familiar face in this neighborhood, often coming in for a quick coffee before heading to her work. People knew her as someone who carried herself with grace and dignity. But little did she know, someone in the shop was about to change that. In walked a police officer, a man in his 40s with a rough demeanor. His face showed a certain disdain as he glanced around the room. His uniform was crisp and his walk was confident, almost cocky. He had a reputation for being rude, especially towards people he thought didn't belong in certain places. He scanned the room, his eyes briefly landing on the woman sitting by the window. She caught his gaze for a moment, but didn't pay him any mind. She had been coming here for months, and this wasn't the first time he had been there. But today, something felt different. The officer walked up to her table, and before she could even respond, he said, "This place is for locals, not for people like you." His voice was loud enough for others to hear. The woman froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening. But she didn't let it show. "Excuse me?" the woman said, her voice calm, but with a hint of confusion. She wasn't used to this, especially not here, in a place she thought was peaceful and welcoming. The officer sneered, his eyes narrowing. "I said, get out." He was almost mocking her, not even waiting for her to explain herself. He grabbed the coffee cup she had just started sipping from, held it above her head for a moment, and then, without warning, splashed the hot coffee all over her clothes. The room fell dead silent. People stopped whatever they were doing and stared. The coffee spilled down her shirt, soaking her clothes in hot liquid. She gasped, her eyes widening from the sudden shock. The officer laughed, thinking he had asserted his dominance. But what happened next would shock everyone. The woman didn't scream, didn't raise her voice. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she simply wiped the coffee off her shirt, looked directly at the officer, and then slowly stood up. The entire room was still. No one knew what would happen next. The officer, feeling smug and in control, watched as she moved. Was she going to argue back? Was she going to get upset? But no. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, composed, with a calm expression. At that moment, the whole room felt a strange sense of anticipation. The woman had taken the officer's insult, but there was something about her demeanor that made everyone think. There was more to her than meets the eye. The officer turned to leave, thinking he had won. But the woman wasn't finished yet. Her secret, something nobody knew about her, was about to come out. The coffee shop, which had been so calm just moments before, was now filled with a strange tension. Everyone in the room could feel that something big was about to happen. What was her secret? And how would the officer react when he learned who she really was? The woman in the coffee shop wasn't just anyone. Her name was Olivia Turner, a black woman in her early 30s, known for her calm and professional demeanor. She had moved to this city years ago, looking for a fresh start, and she quickly established herself in her career. Olivia was a highly respected businesswoman working as a senior executive in a large tech company. Despite her success, she was humble and preferred to stay out of the limelight. She had a quiet routine every morning. Coffee at the same coffee shop, a brief stop before heading to her office. Most of the people there recognized her, but she never sought attention. People saw her as someone who had everything under control, someone who wouldn't cause a scene, and yet no one knew the full story about her. Every morning she would walk into the coffee shop, order her usual, a black coffee with a little cream, and sit near the window. She would spend a few moments on her phone, catching up on emails or reading the news. No one ever bothered her. She was respected, and she liked it that way. But Olivia's calm, peaceful existence was about to be shattered by one officer, Officer Robert Harris. Harris was a Caucasian man in his 40s, a police officer who had a long history of discriminatory behavior. It wasn't just the occasional rude comment. Harris was known for going after anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. His biases ran deep, and he had earned a reputation for targeting minorities, especially in public spaces. He would often patrol the coffee shop area, stopping to make rude remarks or intimidating customers with his presence. On the outside, he looked like just another officer doing his job. But in truth, he had a history of looking down on people he deemed outsiders, especially people of color. And that's how he saw Olivia when he walked into the coffee shop that day. When he first saw her sitting there enjoying her coffee, he felt a sense of entitlement. He had always thought he could control situations, especially when it came to people like her. In his mind, people like Olivia didn't belong in certain places, like a nice coffee shop in a neighborhood that he felt was meant for people like him. The tension had been building for weeks. Every time Harris walked in, he would glance at Olivia, never directly speaking to her, but always giving her judgmental stares. He believed he had some kind of power over the space, and he didn't like the fact that she was comfortable in it. But Olivia, always composed, never reacted. She didn't challenge him. She didn't even look at him. She didn't want any trouble. She just wanted to enjoy her coffee. But that day, something in Harris snapped. He couldn't let her have peace anymore. His anger and prejudice had built up, and it was time for him to act on it. The moment he walked into the shop, his eyes locked onto her, and as if it was a planned attack, he made his way over to her table, ready to throw his racism in her face. He began with a few words, but they weren't about the coffee or the weather. They were about who he thought she was. Someone who didn't belong. His hostility toward her was clear as he confronted her, demanding she leave. But he didn't expect her to stay calm. Harris was so sure he would have the upper hand in this situation. He thought she would be intimidated, that she would back down and apologize. He wasn't prepared for the woman sitting in front of him, the woman who, though quiet, was not someone to be disrespected. Olivia had dealt with racist encounters before, but what happened next was something no one could have predicted. It was just another morning, and the coffee shop was buzzing with its usual crowd. People were sitting at their tables, drinking their coffee, working on their laptops, or chatting with friends. Olivia was seated by the window, enjoying her first sip of the day's coffee. She glanced at her phone, checking her emails, just like she always did. But today was different. As Olivia took another sip, she noticed a familiar figure walk through the door, Officer Harris. The officer she had seen many times before, always standing at the edge of the room, looking around with judgment in his eyes. Today, however, he wasn't standing at the door. This time, he was walking straight toward her. He didn't greet her, didn't ask if she was enjoying her coffee. He just stared at her, his eyes cold. Olivia, despite his gaze, didn't flinch. She simply looked back at her phone, pretending not to notice him. She didn't want any trouble. She just wanted a quiet morning. But Harris had made up his mind. He walked up to her table, his boots clicking loudly against the wooden floor. He was standing too close to her, but she didn't move. He wasn't there to have a conversation. He was there to make a statement. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice loud and stern. The words were meant to sting. Olivia's eyes lifted from her phone and she looked at him, surprised. But she didn't speak. She was calm, too calm, and it confused Harris. He expected her to stand up, argue back, or even apologize. But instead, Olivia simply said, "I'm just here for my coffee." That answer only made Harris angrier. He wanted to assert control over the space, and she wasn't playing by his rules. The more she remained calm, the more irritated he became. "This is for local people, not for people like you," Harris added, his tone growing more dismissive. People in the coffee shop were starting to notice. Some of them turned their heads, unsure of what was going on. The once lively atmosphere of the shop now felt like it was filled with tension. Everyone was silently watching, waiting for something to happen. But Harris wasn't finished. He was determined to make Olivia feel small, to show her that, in his eyes, she didn't belong. He grabbed the coffee cup that Olivia had been drinking from and, with a quick motion, splashed the hot coffee all over her. The hot liquid hit Olivia's shirt and she immediately stood up, shocked but not reacting in the way Harris had expected. The room went silent. People gasped. Olivia's clothes were soaked with the hot coffee and her expression showed disbelief. But she didn't shout. Harris, on the other hand, was laughing. He thought this was a victory. In his mind, he had successfully humiliated her, proven his point that she was in the wrong. He had crossed a line, and in his arrogance, he believed he had won. But what happened next left him, and everyone in the coffee shop, speechless. Instead of reacting with anger, Olivia simply wiped the coffee off her shirt, straightened her clothes, and looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't shout, didn't cry. She was calm, too calm for Harris to handle. The people around them were still waiting for Olivia's response, and Harris, standing in front of her with a smug smile, was now starting to feel a bit uneasy. Something about the woman in front of him didn't fit the role he had imagined. She wasn't angry. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid. And there was something more about her, something he didn't know. Olivia wasn't just another person sitting in a coffee shop. The tension in the room continued to rise as Harris stared at her, trying to read her face. Olivia stood still, staring back, not flinching. The officer thought he had everything under control, but the truth was, he had misjudged her completely. And what happened next would change everything. The coffee shop was still silent after the incident. Olivia stood tall, her hands slightly shaking as she wiped the coffee from her shirt. She wasn't angry, but the burning sensation of the coffee on her skin reminded her of how far this officer had crossed the line. Her face, however, was calm, composed even. It was as though the world had slowed down, and she knew exactly what was coming next. As she stood there, her eyes locked with the officer's. His smug expression, filled with satisfaction, slowly turned into a look of unease. He couldn't understand why she hadn't reacted the way most people would have. He thought for sure she would yell, throw something back at him, or even make a scene. But there she stood, unshaken. Harris didn't like being ignored. He didn't like the feeling of not having control, and right now, he felt like he was losing it. He expected this woman to cower, to be embarrassed, to let him have the upper hand. But she didn't. And it scared him. "I don't know who you think you are," Harris sneered, his voice rising a little. "But I don't have time for your attitude. You don't belong here." Olivia, still holding her composure, simply took a deep breath. She looked around the coffee shop where everyone had stopped what they were doing. The murmurs from the surrounding tables were growing louder as more and more people realized the seriousness of what had just occurred. "I belong here as much as anyone else?" Olivia said calmly, her voice unwavering. The tension was so thick in the air that you could feel it in your chest. Harris was taken aback by her unshakable confidence. What made this woman so sure of herself? He had been rude, disrespectful, and even violent. But she didn't seem to care. She didn't seem to mind the injustice being done to her. But Olivia wasn't just a victim of this racist officer's actions. She was far more than he could ever imagine. At that moment, a man walked into the coffee shop. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, and had a presence that immediately shifted the energy in the room. People whispered among themselves, and the officer's eyes widened as he took in the man's appearance. The man walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the room, and when he saw Olivia, his expression softened. He quickly moved towards her, walking past the officer without so much as a glance. "Olivia, are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but full of concern. The officer looked confused for a moment. Who was this man? Why did he care so much about the woman he had just humiliated? But Olivia's eyes lit up as she smiled softly at the man. "I'm fine, Dad," she replied. At the mention of her father's name, the atmosphere in the coffee shop shifted. The officer's face paled as the realization slowly dawned on him. The man in the suit wasn't just any passerby. He was someone important. Olivia's father was no ordinary man. The man walked over to Olivia, putting a hand on her shoulder. His presence alone was enough to make the tension in the room melt away, and people began to murmur in disbelief. The coffee shop crowd, which had been silent moments before, was now filled with questions. Who was this man, and why did Olivia seem so calm? The officer, his face now a mixture of confusion and regret, took a step back. "You're her father?" Harris stammered, his voice shaky. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Olivia's father turned to the officer, his expression no longer warm. "Yes, I am." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. "And you've made a mistake." The cop opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man in front of him was important. He could feel it. He looked at Olivia, then at her father, and suddenly everything about the situation clicked. Olivia wasn't just a regular woman sitting at the coffee shop. She wasn't just an ordinary citizen he could push around. She was someone powerful, someone he had disrespected, and now he was starting to feel the weight of his actions. Olivia's father didn't waste any more time. "You owe my daughter an apology." His voice was calm but filled with authority. "What you did to her was not only wrong but illegal." Harris tried to recover his composure. "I didn't know who she was. I thought—" His words trailed off as he realized he had no excuse. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" Harris started, but Olivia's father raised a hand to stop him. "It's too late for apologies." He turned to the coffee shop's manager, who had quietly watched the entire scene unfold. "You should fire this man immediately." The manager, looking uncomfortable, nodded. He knew there would be consequences for what had happened, but he wasn't prepared for this. The cop had crossed a line, and now he was going to pay for it. But Olivia's father didn't stop there. He turned back to the officer, his expression hardening. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice now cold and firm. "I am William Turner, CEO of Turner Enterprises, a leader in the business world, and someone who has spent his life fighting against injustice and discrimination. What you did today was a stain on your badge and your reputation." The officer's face turned white. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought Olivia was just another person he could bully. He thought he could throw his weight around and get away with it. But now, standing before him was someone with real power, someone who had made a difference in the world and someone who could bring the full force of the law down on him. William Turner didn't have to say anything else. The power in his words and his presence were enough to make the officer tremble. The entire coffee shop was now silent, everyone waiting for what would happen next. The room was thick with tension. Officer Harris stood frozen, his face pale as he processed what was happening. His attempt to humiliate Olivia had just backfired in the most dramatic way. He had thought that with his badge, he could get away with anything. But now, standing before him, was a man who commanded respect. William Turner, a name Harris had heard of but never imagined he would encounter in a coffee shop. William Turner's reputation was well known, not just in the business world, but also as someone who had fought against racism and injustice for years. And here he was, standing up for his daughter in a way Harris had never expected. Olivia had kept her calm, but her father's presence made the situation even more intense. "You made a mistake today, officer," William said, his voice calm but firm. His words were powerful, and every word seemed to hit Harris like a ton of bricks. A mistake that could cost you your career. Harris didn't know how to respond. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had spent years trying to uphold the law, but now, in front of this powerful man and his daughter, he realized how badly he had acted. "I didn't know who she was," Harris stammered, but William interrupted him with a single gesture. He didn't need to hear excuses. Harris had crossed the line, and there was no excuse that would make up for what he had done. "It doesn't matter who she is." William's voice was steady, but it carried weight. "You should have never treated anyone that way. You didn't have the right to put your hands on her, regardless of her identity. What you did was wrong. And now, there are consequences." The crowd in the coffee shop, which had been silently watching the scene unfold, began to murmur among themselves. It was clear to everyone that the officer was in the wrong. They had all seen what happened, and now they were watching to see how this would play out. The manager, who had been standing in the corner, finally spoke up. He walked toward the officer with a look of disapproval. "I think it's time you leave, officer." Harris looked around the room, his face filled with embarrassment. The people who had been silent just moments ago were now all looking at him with disapproval. His once confident posture crumbled. The realization that he had not just mistreated a woman but also disrespected someone powerful was sinking in. "What are you going to do? Call the cops on me?" Harris muttered, trying to save face. William Turner shook his head, unfazed. "No need. The damage has already been done. Your actions have already been seen by enough people to make it clear what happened here today. And trust me, this won't be forgotten." As William spoke, the tension in the coffee shop began to dissipate. The feeling of unease slowly turned to solidarity. Olivia's calmness and her father's strength had made everyone realize that standing up to injustice could lead to powerful change. People who had been sitting in the shop, too afraid to speak out earlier, were now starting to stand up. A woman at a nearby table stood up and addressed the officer. "You shouldn't have done that. No one deserves to be treated that way." She spoke with quiet but firm conviction. A few others nodded in agreement, their voices growing louder. "We all saw what happened. We won't stand for it." Another person added. The officer looked around, realizing that he had lost control of the situation. He thought that he could intimidate Olivia, but now, with the presence of her father and the support of everyone in the room, he saw just how wrong he had been. Finally, Harris turned and walked out of the coffee shop, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed. He had been forced to leave, not by the authority of the law, but by the power of justice. He had underestimated the woman he tried to humiliate, and he had paid the price. As the door closed behind him, the room exhaled. The coffee shop, which had felt suffocating just moments ago, now felt lighter, filled with a sense of relief and unity. Olivia and her father stood together, their connection stronger than ever. Olivia looked up at her father, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. I don't know what I would have done without you." William smiled softly, his eyes warm. "You didn't need me to fight for you, Olivia. You handled yourself perfectly. But I will always have your back, no matter what." The two shared a quiet moment, knowing that together they had faced down injustice. But this wasn't just about one incident in a coffee shop. It was about standing up against racism and discrimination wherever it appeared. The story of what had happened spread quickly throughout the city. People were talking about the officer's actions and the courage Olivia had shown in the face of racism. And while the cop faced the consequences of his behavior, Olivia became a symbol of strength and dignity in the face of oppression. The tension in the coffee shop slowly started to settle. Officer Harris had left, his pride shattered and his reputation tainted. The room, which had been filled with a sense of discomfort and unease, was now lighter. People who had witnessed the incident were beginning to speak with one another, exchanging thoughts and words of support for Olivia and her father. It was clear that something powerful had just happened. But while the officer had been humiliated and forced to leave, the events of the day were not over. Olivia and her father stood in the center of the room, their expressions calm, but filled with strength and conviction. They had not only faced a racist act, but had also taken a stand against it in the most powerful way possible. As the manager of the coffee shop approached them, he couldn't hide the shame on his face. "I want to apologize for what happened today, Olivia," he said, his voice sincere. "No one should have to go through that, especially not here. This is a place for everyone." Olivia smiled, her expression softening. "Thank you, but what matters now is that we all stand up for what's right." Her father, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. "We've all seen what happens when we stay silent. It's time for all of us to speak up, to make sure this doesn't happen again." The people in the coffee shop, who had been silently watching and listening, were now starting to nod in agreement. It wasn't just Olivia's strength and composure that had made an impact. It was also the support of the community around her. The silence that once filled the room was being replaced with solidarity. The next day, news of the incident spread quickly. The story made headlines in the local newspaper, and social media was flooded with posts about what had happened in that coffee shop. People from all walks of life, not just from Olivia's city, but from around the world, began to share their thoughts on the issue of racism in society. The police department launched an investigation into Officer Harris's behavior. They quickly reviewed the incident, and it didn't take long for them to realize that his actions were completely unacceptable. Harris was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and it wasn't long before he was fired from the force. The coffee shop, which had once been a quiet and peaceful place, became a symbol of standing up against discrimination and racism. People continued to visit, but now they did so with a new understanding of the power of community and solidarity. Olivia's calm response to such a hurtful act had shown everyone that it was possible to face hatred and injustice with dignity, and that violence could be met with strength. As for Olivia and her father, they weren't just concerned with what had happened in that moment. They knew that this was just one example of a much larger problem that needed to be addressed. The conversation about racism and injustice was now in the spotlight, and they were both determined to keep it there. "This isn't the end, Olivia. It's just the beginning," William said, his voice filled with a sense of resolve. "I know, Dad. I know," Olivia replied, looking up at him with pride. Olivia became a symbol of strength, resilience, and justice. And soon after the incident, she started receiving messages from people who had been inspired by her actions. Some were strangers, others were familiar faces, who admired the way she stood up for herself and didn't let hatred define her. People shared their own stories of injustice and began asking themselves how they could take a stand in their own lives. Olivia's story sparked conversations in homes, schools, workplaces, and social media platforms around the world. It was a conversation that needed to happen, and now it was impossible to ignore. The message was clear. Racism and discrimination could not be allowed to go unchecked. But there was hope, too. The hope that when people stand up together, change is possible. The hope that when people like Olivia face injustice with courage, it inspires others to do the same. As the days went by, Olivia continued her work, but she also began to speak out more publicly about the need for change. She was invited to speak at events, and her story was shared across the world. She used her platform to continue the fight against discrimination, knowing that the more people who spoke out, the more likely things would change. Her father stood by her, proud of the way she handled herself and the way she was using her voice to make a difference. Together, they knew that this was just the start of a larger movement. The world had seen what one person's bravery could do to bring attention to a problem. Now it was time for everyone to take part in that change. And as the story of Olivia and her father continued to inspire people across the world, it became clear that the fight against racism was far from over. But it was one that could be won if people like them kept standing up for what's right. As the story of Olivia and her father began to spread across the city, the ripple effect didn't stop there. People everywhere were starting to ask themselves, what would I have done in that situation? What happens when you witness injustice? Will you stand up for what's right, or stay silent like so many others? The truth is, what happened in that coffee shop is a story that can repeat itself anywhere, in any corner of the world. Every day, people face discrimination, racism, and injustice, whether it's at the workplace, in public spaces, or even in their own homes. But it doesn't have to be that way. Olivia and her father didn't just teach us about standing up against hatred. They showed us the power of community and unity. The people in that coffee shop who had stayed silent at first, who had been too afraid to speak up, began to see the importance of standing together when someone is wronged. Imagine if every one of us took a stand like Olivia did. Imagine if every time we saw someone treated unfairly, we stood up and said, "This is not right, and I will not be silent." It's time to take action. Now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Olivia's place? Would you have remained calm like she did, or would you have reacted differently? In the comments below, tell us how you would stand up for yourself and others in the face of injustice. Your voice matters. We also encourage you to share this video with your friends and family. The more people who hear this story, the more who can join the movement for equality, justice, and peace. It's important that we continue to have these conversations and challenge the systems that allow discrimination to thrive. Share this with the world so that we can spread the message that we will no longer tolerate injustice. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Every story has the potential to change someone's life and make a difference. Let's spread the word that standing up for what's right is always worth it, no matter the cost. The fight against racism and discrimination is ongoing, but with people like Olivia and her father leading the way, we can all contribute to creating a world where justice prevails. Together, we can make a difference. And thank you for watching. Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice can change the world.